Well, we are really out of the curve today, aren't we?
What?
At 11:53.
Well, that's because we gotta
That
be
is
done.
highly unusual.
We gotta be done by like 11:50, 12:55. So yeah. What? Huh? Oh, Dr. Whitehead. Oh, okay. So we are ready. All right, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Leadership Blend with your host Ricardi Rice and my co-host
Simone Shuri.
and correspondent
Cameron Wallace.
All right, so we are back in the studio today. Not as exciting as it was around inauguration time, but still, nonetheless, it's been some funny stuff going on. And we also have a very special guest today. So before we get started, I'm going to allow her to introduce herself and tell y'all a little bit about her. So Dr. Whitehead, it's your time.
Thank you. My name is Dr. LaToria Whitehead, and I guess I'll give a little bit about my background. Okay. I am a public health advisor for a federal agency for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I'm also an adjunct professor, and I have a consulting firm which focuses on environmental justice issues. The interview today for me, I will make a disclaimer to say that what I am speaking of today is not a reflection of the federal government, but a reflection of my own research and my own values. So I'll just put that out there.
Very cool.
And I guess that's it. Unless you wanted me to.
We're excited to have you. Ricardo's been talking about you for weeks and weeks. We've had
Okay,
other
what
guests
you're not
coming
about
up.
to do is put me on
We
blast.
have had other guests coming up,
What
and he
you
has said,
not-
but then the week after that, we're going to
What
talk
you
about
not
this.
gonna do? Okay, so everybody knows that Simone tried. She
like,
tried
that's part
today.
of this guest.
You feel you mighty sensitive now. She tried it today, but everybody knows I like new knowledge. So in December, I think it was December, either December or November, one of the two. My days keep running.
Yeah, I think it was I want to
Maybe-
say November.
You might be right. Mine was November.
I want to say November.
So in November, most people that follow me, you know, I did a series of speakers. I think it was 5 of them from MogulCon with Dr. Felicia Phillips, who I absolutely adore. Shouts out to Felicia Phillips, Leslie Tops, and Deidre. She changed her last name. Deidre. She know who I'm talking to. And Dr. Whitehead was one of those 5, and she was actually the last one. And, you know, we had this conversation. She introduced this thing called environmental justice. And like I said, in my head, I thought it was about tree huggers. So I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting slightly. But, you know, it's what it is. And then we started talking about it, and it just, like, latched on to me. I was like, oh, my God, why are we not talking about this? This could be the answer to so many issues we're having in our communities. And from there, when we were done, I think me and your interview ended, and we talked for another 30 minutes, like, which I had not done with any of the other 4. Not that they were not equally good, but, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, you got to come on the show, because we really should be talking about this concept of environmental justice. So that's what we're talking about today. But we're going to do some current events, because there is some interesting stuff going on. Then we'll get back to Dr. Whitehead, and y'all can see why I really want her here. So, Simone, what's on the rundown?
So we should talk a little bit about what's going on with the hostility in the Republican Party, just because there's a lot of an article came out this morning in NPR, and people have been reporting about it for weeks, the tension within the party, and the Republicans who are blaming Trump for the Senate loss in the state of Georgia, which is going to change this administration entirely for the first time in a while. And then on the other side, Republicans feeling like it's Georgia that's the problem, and our governor that's the problem, and the Secretary of State that didn't do enough. So there's a couple of updates there, and then also with regard to national security on that front. And then we can talk a little bit about Robin Hood if you like. And
I can give a brief
pull
overview.
something up, and we can talk a little bit
I
about
think
it.
it's so complicated. I don't even think you can really just kind of get into it and get out of it. It's really complicated. And I saw somebody give a breakdown, and you know, I'm pretty smart, but yeah, I would really have to sit down and get into it. I just find it funny that when you look at the overall ideology of it, the fact is amateurs got together and did what Wall Street does all the time. And the fact that they were able to do it and kind of cause this uproar, now all of a sudden Wall Street's like, no. You know, now we should start policing these apps like Robin Hood and so on and so forth. That was the funny part for me. So yeah, but let's start with whatever you want to start with.
So we can start with the GOP situation. So this has been a really quick administration. The Senate race was obviously a very important race, and there's all this talk about the elections and election security around that time. And even now, for the state of Georgia, our session just started on the 11th, so not even 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks ago. And there are a flurry of bills, which I'm sure there will continue to be about elections and election security. And we're seeing all these different states have conversations as well. Arizona actually, I think, is considering having the state declare the elections rather than having it go elsewhere. I think we talked about Colorado briefly a couple of shows back, and they were considering doing away with or they wanted to be the first to sign on to support the end of the Electoral College and the beginning of the popular vote. So we're seeing, I think, a lot of the collateral consequences of people not trusting the elections, but also just how crazy the elections have been. And what do you think? What do you have to say about these changes in general? I do remember that you were one of a few people who felt like voting in person was very important and you wanted to vote in person. I do remember that. I'm not saying that you can't, but there are also a lot of Republicans right now in Georgia who are, and the governor as well, Governor Kemp, who are having conversations about whether or not absentee voting or voting by mail should be allowed with no excuses, or if it should be limited to a very certain population who just truly need to vote by mail. And if there is going to continue to be voting by mail, whether or not you have to submit way more documentation than you currently do if you're already a registered voter. So that would essentially complicate the process, and we'll still have to see how that goes because it's very early. But I would like to know, as a vote-in-person supporter, if you think that all these would be very good changes for us to make.
I feel like this is garbage.
That?
I feel like this is garbage.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we're literally seeing two different agendas. Like, we're seeing the Democrats who are now in power really saying, no, we need to focus and get a lot of this stuff done. I feel like the Republicans are going around still saying that the election was stolen and this are all the repercussions and now all the things they want to put in place. Mind you, before all this happened, we had this conversation. Before all this happened previously, when the Republicans kept saying, oh, well, the election is not secure and we need to pass this and pass that. So we already kind of did this. Now you guys just infuriated that you lost the Senate, you lost the presidency. Now you're just infuriated. I feel like even though the big baby's gone, the little babies are still crying and still trying to hold on to bottles and hold on to formula. And it's really annoying because there's so much stuff going on in the world, particularly, with COVID still running rampant. Now they're talking about new strands coming from South Africa or something that they've seen. Like, we do not have time for this. You guys lost. The Democrats have lost many times in the last couple of years. They took it. They took the L and they kept moving. They tried to work with you guys. So now I feel like we're at this impasse where you see a lot of Democrats saying, you know what, the stronger ones, screw the Republicans. They're still crying, trying to hold on the bottles. We got stuff we need to do. Let's move on with that. And others are saying, well, no, we need to be bipartisan. We try to work together. I get it. But at the end of the day, the American people, the middle class, the poor people, especially the ones that COVID have thrust into poverty, they're suffering. So we need to focus on what needs to be done. We don't have time to worry about election and all that stuff. We already did it. You guys lost. Move on. Take the L. Let's go.
Yeah. So Biden, I think during the last show, he had signed his first 4 executive orders.
And he keeps signing them.
Yeah, he's up to 40.
He keeps signing them.
He's definitely up to 40 executive orders. And I think the only thing that would solve any of these squabbles, and I'm not saying this is a good solution at all, but it would have to be some sort of uniform voting approach, period. Like, every country does not have a distinct voting process for every one of its locales where they can do it different ways, different times, different deadlines. We have a very unique situation in which, especially in Georgia with 159 counties, where there's a lot of autonomy at a local level about how voting happens for a national election, and that's something that a lot of countries don't have. I don't know, without some sort of a uniform process, that you could alleviate a lot of these issues or questions, and whether or not some states let you vote by mail or not. But
let's be real. Like, I'm gonna pose this out there, which I normally would not do, but I do kind of feel this way. I kind of feel like because black folks actually voted for real and actually showed the power that we really do have, I feel like that's some of this too. I normally wouldn't say that, but I kind of feel that way. I normally would not say that, but I really feel that way. I feel like because we came out and we showed the power we have, if we're unified, that now all of a sudden, and because I watched the language, certain classes, certain people. Like, when those words start getting tossed around, I get uneasy and I get really in research mode. Like, what do you mean? Certain classes of people that should vote. Are we talking about old folks? Are we talking about the suburb? What are you talking about when you say certain classes of people? So I get really itchy when that kind of stuff happens. And I honestly feel like that's kind of some of this mixed in. But, I digress. Cam, what's your thoughts?
Well, I'll just say that, it's very powerful that, black people definitely did. We mobilized enough votes to actually put Biden in office. And voter is even more impressive being the fact that voter suppression was at an all-time high during this election. So it says a lot about, the dynamic shift of where we're going. And the validity in, the argument of mail-in ballots is, literally 0 to none. There's no valid argument that mail-in ballots really swung the election in no way, and that there should be no argument that, that the mail-in ballots swung the election in no way. I personally feel like, yes, it did help in a sense, being the fact that we are facing a new wave of how we should be doing the elections with COVID and everything like that. But I just feel like the mail-in ballots was the process of the voter suppression, in my personal opinion. So that's just how I kind of saw it with this election, like pushing the whole mail-in ballots and stuff like that. It really did that. So I was a very strong advocate for actually going to vote in person.
I do too. I mean, we could do everything else, so why not slap on a mask and go vote? We do everything else.
Honestly,
you go to the grocery
we be
store,
doing
you go to
everything
concerts.
else. Yes.
Why you can't put on a mask and go vote? But I digress. Dr. Whitehead, any thoughts?
I think that there is a Republican agenda to create a problem now. Through past, so many years, Republicans are not used to, I'll say, losing, for lack of a better term. And so I think that there is an agenda, and there's a bit of bitterness here to now create a problem because you did lose the election, and now you want to come up with different rules in different intricacies in a different way. And this is a prime example of this, right? So in the 2013 case that we did lose, that case that added to voter suppression. What we're hoping is that when we lost that 2013 Supreme case, that's now helping counties to create all these different rules and regulations. When we look at different classes of voting, we're hoping with that this particular Biden administration that they could outlaw that case and we won't have these different issues. And that's just putting that in a very succinct and very short manner. So that's what I'm hoping that would happen in this specific administration. But I think that that's what's going on here. Now, there's a problem that's now trying to be created because they did lose the election with these different rules. But I'm hoping that we could outlaw that 2013 Supreme Court case and we could get rid of the disenfranchisement that's been going on.
Yeah, that's a big one for me for sure, too. I think we should talk next show a little bit more about this because we're going to see if Biden's calls for unity are going to
resonate.
Right, or get anywhere, because I think what we're kind of seeing right now is this fervor from the Republican Party about, forget that. That's just not going to happen. But some of his cabinet positions are very interesting. His agenda is very ambitious, I think, in a lot of ways. But he's definitely trying to fill the cabinet with a couple of interesting people that a lot of liberals don't understand why they're there. So I think we should talk a little bit about that too, and
because they're
what
qualified.
Unity looks like. What unity
because
looks
they're qualified.
Like.
What
unity looks like.
I don't know. It's frustrating, especially if it wasn't for COVID and how serious this is, especially for our communities. I probably would be a little less lenient, but there's too much going on for us to still be crying, for you guys to still be crying about having lost the election. Right. Let's take it and keep moving. So
a couple of updates there. There's a $1.9 trillion relief package that Biden wants to pass. I think we talked a little bit about that before. He would obviously like it to be bipartisan supported. He would like Republicans to back it. Democrats are, especially a handful of the most vocal ones, are happy to go it alone. So we'll see how that works. Also, Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. They've released a couple new reports about the efficacy rate dropping a bit. Dropping from 72% in the United States to just 57% in South Africa. And apparently there's a strain. There are multiple strains now that are coming out and being discussed. You'll see a lot of headlines about the UK strain. And in addition, a strain in South Africa, which they're saying is not the same, if I understand correctly, but where efficacy seems to be much lower. And today there's another vaccine that I think is being rolled out by an additional company. So hopefully there'll be plenty of vaccines to go around very, very quickly.
It's not even about the vaccine. It's about the distribution of these vaccines. We have. And previously it was just sitting around, in essence, kind of spoiling because the demand and the supply wasn't equal. They're making it, but people are not really getting it because it's kind of like, okay, well, because I had somebody I was talking to yesterday. She's actually a nurse. And she was like, well, I'm not getting it. I was like, well, why are you not getting it? She was like, because it's kind of like the flu vaccine. It's kind of like something they give you and to build up your immune system or something to that magnitude. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. And you're actually a nurse and are probably more prone to get it. But it's about this we need a distribution plan. We can't just have it. Where are we going to roll it out to? How are we going to do it? What kind of time frame we're looking at? That's the issue.
Yeah, I think that's also a challenge, and that's also been left a lot to local control so far. Now, I think Governor Kemp did announce during a press conference last week that he was going to up the amounts that they were requesting, and so he is trying to change and make up for that deficit. But there was a lot of reports from activist groups about target areas not being reached first. So about the distribution plan. Even though they've mapped out areas where populations were hit the hardest, the distribution plan doesn't seem to be in line with those areas, especially when we're talking about low-income communities or communities of color. So I have heard a lot of complaints about that, even in Georgia.
I think the interesting thing that I read an article yesterday was they were talking about executive orders. And what I don't want to see is this repetitive cycle where every president comes in and does 15 executive orders, and when he leaves office, the person behind him does 15 executive orders to undo what he's just did. So I don't want to see that cycle. Now, that article brought that up, and I thought that's a very good point, because technically things are supposed to be brought through Congress. That's the purpose of having Congress. If we're just going to do executive orders, why do we need a Congress? But at the same token, Congress is supposed to be able to get on one page, put their differences to the side, and pass legislation. So we have a really big issue in government right now.
Yeah,
and
we sure do.
It is what it is. Let's move on. We'll be here all
Yes,
day.
please do. Yes, let's do it.
Was that all the major things?
Yes.
All right. So we're going to shift over into today's subject, which is environmental justice. People are probably going, what in God's name does that mean? I said the same thing, but I assure you that the doctor over here is going to bring it home. And when we're done, you'll be like, oh my God, we should have been talking about this. So let's start from the beginning. Dr. Whitehead, what is environmental justice?
Well, let me go back just a second, if you don't mind. So the environment has its own evolution, right? And so the Environmental Protection Agency was created under the Nixon administration. And when EPA was created, Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, it was created to protect people from environmental hazards, but it was also created to protect the environment. And so in that, back in that time, as time has moved forward, as science has moved forward, we have connected human health with the environment. So then you have various policies and regulations that have been created to protect people's health against the environment, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we realize is that even with those policies that have been created, people of color have bear more than their share of environmental hazards, right? And so when we look at this, I'm going to specifically say today I'm going to use an example of people of color. I'm going to use black people. When we look at this, from black people from low income, middle income to high income, still bear more than their share of environmental hazards. That means that there is not just a problem with my income, but there's a problem also with my race, right? In connection to what we call environmental injustice. And so in 1979, Alexander versus Sandoval, just to give you a quick example, this is an example where you have a middle-income black community fighting environmental hazards, fighting toxic waste landfills being placed in their community. Now, they're a middle-income black community. They lost the case, right? So in 1982, you have Warren County, where what we call this environmental justice movement has began, because now this is still a black community, but it's a low-income black community. Same problem, same race, ethnicity, but different income, right? And so with Warren County, this sparked the movement where environmental justice was created. That name was created by the community. It wasn't created by the federal government. It wasn't created by CDC, EPA. Environmental justice, that term was created by the community. And so in 1982, Warren County, when you have this group of people in neighborhoods and they say, hey, you know what, you're not going to put this in my community, this sparked a movement. Over 500 people were arrested. It was on the news. People were like, well, what's going on? These people are laying down in the streets saying that you're not going to put these toxic waste landfills, you're not going to put these things in my community. And so environmental justice is when there is, you are bearing more than your share of environmental hazards due to your race, ethnicity, due to low income. And that is what we call environmental injustice. Environmental justice is when we can get to a point where we are all sharing the same amount of environmental hazards or environmental risk, right? And so, in time, where in the 1980s, where we specifically started off with things that you could really, grasp when it comes to environment, such as water, such as air, pollution when it comes to environmental hazards. You have these group of people, these advocates, the community that say, you know what, environmental justice is not just about, air and water. What about access? What about transportation? What about what's in my neighborhood? When I walk out of my neighborhood, do I have, and Ricardo, we talked about this a little bit, do I have more check cashing stores in my neighborhood and dollar stores?
Predatory lending in these neighborhoods.
Versus
sorry, I just had to say that. Predatory lending.
That's okay. Versus, a Publix and, Whole Foods. But I have, 10 different hair stores, different kind of hair, all that type of thing. Where's the transportation in my neighborhood versus the other neighborhood? Because transportation access is very important, because where are all the good jobs at? All the good jobs are on the other side of town, but I don't have transportation in my neighborhood to get there. So that's when we get into racial residential segregation, of course, where we're segregated from, certain amenities, if you will, versus other amenities in other neighborhoods. All of that is a part of environmental justice. So environmental justice it's expanded itself, if you will, for the last couple of decades here, where we're not just thinking about, looking at air and water, which is very important, but now we're looking at also transportation access, what we call social mismatch. Sociologists call it social mismatch, where I'm over here and everything else is over there. Now we're looking at what we call the built environment. What is in my neighborhood? Do I have sidewalks? We're looking at safe jobs as well, what one may call green energy jobs. It's something that, the city of Atlanta is trying to create more of. So environmental injustice is when we're bearing more than our share of environmental hazards, where all these different social determinants of health that I just described can impact you in a negative way. Environmental justice is where we get to a point where we're all bearing, the same amount of environmental hazards.
Gotcha.
Cam, I'll let you ask the first question. What's your thought process?
I guess my first question would be, how do we know when environmental justice is achieved? When you said like everyone would have equal access to opportunities, but some people don't necessarily have. Like, for example, I went to a very poor high school in a sense, as far as like the education and like retention and all the stuff like that. I went to a very underperforming high school. I wasn't able to get the education that I really thought I deserved, because it would cost me so much more. It would cost me and my parents so much more to relocate to another district, even if I lived in the same district, or even if I moved to that district. So how do we know like when environmental justice is achieved, when it literally trickled down to things like education and transportation and grocery stores, and like, because in my
like
hometown,
that broad question. Like, is there anywhere where it does exist? Is there a country?
A prototype or a standard? Is there a standard or a prototype that we can measure it by?
I would say that that's a great question. I would say that model would look like sustainable neighborhoods, but also neighborhoods where, as you just described, in my neighborhood, I have the same quality of, and I'm glad you use schools, because schools, that's a good example too, especially when we talk about racial residential segregation, right? Because when we are racially segregated, we are separated from good quality schools and transportation and access, to other things, foods, which is connected to food insecurity and things of that nature. And so all of that quality of life, social determinants of health goes into that. So when we look at what environmental justice looks like whether I am in Decatur, whether I am in Southwest Atlanta neighborhood, and whether I am in Alpharetta, I still have the same quality of amenities that you have, and so we're starting off kind of like at the same pace. So my quality of schools are just as good. Just because I'm in a poor neighborhood, a low income neighborhood, my quality of schools are still just as good as your quality of schools in your neighborhood. My transportation access is still there here in my neighborhood versus in Alpharetta. So if there is a low income neighborhood over in wherever you're at, Decatur or whatever, and a lot of those people in that neighborhood don't have transportation access, that means that they have a MARTA that's been put there, where now they do have transportation access, or something is happening, from the city, from the state, to help this specific neighborhood. Now we have, instead of you building more check cashing stores, now we have more grocery stores for food security. So a part of environmental justice is where my neighborhood is very, it doesn't exactly look like your neighborhood, but I do have those same amenities that I do have access to, where I can not really start off in the same place, but I have an equal chance to have what we call optimal health.
Okay. So, and you may have been about to get into this, but my next question is exactly that. So, like, what the tenants are, because we all know about Flint, which was a disaster. And I think we also talked about water a little bit on the show, like the different qualities of water, which I think they do grade on a state-by-state basis, or even more localized. And it's very surprising to see the differences in water. And I know this when I travel, because every state that I've been to, I always want to try the water. And there are just significant differences from state by state in terms of what the tap water tastes like, what the air smells like. So is environmental justice also like tenets of like how much pollution is in one place versus another, or how much whether or not you can drink the water?
Absolutely. That's
Okay.
a good question, too. So the Environmental Protection Agency has a, if you go online, you can put in if you go online right now, you can put in your zip code, right? And you can see exactly what's in your neighborhood. You can see if I have, if I have chemical factories in my neighborhood or what kind of companies I have in my neighborhood. I can put that zip code in and I can look at what's in my neighborhood and how those different companies are connected to, air pollution. So what my air zone looks like in 30294 versus what it looks like in 30035. Well, what actually separates that? I'm over here, you're over there. Again, we're going back to different neighborhoods. And yes, to answer your question, my air smells different from your air. Why? Not because of the earth, it's because of what's in my neighborhood, right? So to answer your question, yes. And so when you look at air pollution, as you use that example, you look at water, what you're looking at is these different systems that make up that neighborhood. So if I have, this company in my neighborhood, and I don't have that, those different chemical companies in my neighborhood and the other neighborhood, that's when I walk out the door again, my air's gonna smell different, and more than likely my neighborhood looks different from your neighborhood. And so we have these, the federal government has these different type of mechanisms where you can put in your zip code and you can see what's in your neighborhood versus what's in another neighborhood, and then that answers the question of why does this smell like this over here, just to put it in very simple terms, versus why it looks like that and smells like that, over there.
Okay, so when we were done with our initial conversation, me and you, I immediately thought about gentrification versus environmental justice. The ideology that you're willing to pay me to move out of this bad neighborhood so that you can do a revamp on it and invite your friends and family in and live your best life. In essence, and that's kind of an abridged version of gentrification to me. So when it comes to environmental justice being kind of the combat and versus it saying, no, you're not going to pay us to move out. We're going to better this community so that we can enjoy those spoils just as much. When it comes to legislation, where does this fall? Like, it sounds like something that falls in like the commissioner because they have their hands. When Jericho was here, she was talking about all things she's kind of privy to. Where does that fall when we talk about legislation? Whose privy does it fall under?
Well, so if we're going to talk about Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, when you talk about gentrification, so we're looking at more than likely looking at urban neighborhoods or low income neighborhoods where we're going from low to high. We're trying to get this from low to high. We're trying to make this look like from here to there, just very, very simplified. And so what happens is we all know that you have displacement of people now because now I can't even afford to live there, right? So now I'm displaced and I have to go into another neighborhood. Now, if I'm already low income and I can't afford this neighborhood, now I'm going into a low income neighborhood. How does EJ come in? Environmental justice, environmental injustice comes in where now you have a group of people that are displaced. And more than likely, they are displaced in neighborhoods that we are discussing. They are displaced in neighborhoods where they don't have sidewalks, they don't have open space, they don't have an optimal built environment for these different things, which connects to asthma, which connects to waterborne illnesses we're talking about storm and climate change, and that's a whole other subject, which connects to transportation access, which connects to lead poisoning if you're in a house built before 1978. So you're connected where these same low-income populations are displaced, and now they are more prone to what we call health disparities. Now, if you look at gentrification and what can be done, the optimal thing would be you fix that neighborhood up and people can actually still live in that neighborhood. That is something that could fall under the mayor's office with the city of Atlanta when you're talking about
We're talking about Keisha. Oh, God.
When you're talking about looking at specific neighborhoods and affordable housing, that is a plan that could fall under the mayor's office with actually making sure that, people have affordable housing, making sure that they could stay there and that it is still, fixed up, if you will.
Well, I guess
as far as policy.
Well, in my thought process, I guess now that we say, I feel like now we're trying to fix symptoms. So when we say we're building affordable housing, that's great, but where are you putting it at? Like, are you putting it next to a landfill? Like, where are you putting this affordable housing? So it's kind of like we're trying to fix symptoms versus the root cause of it.
Right.
Now, you had previously said that John Lewis was working on.
Yes, Congressman John Lewis.
Congressman John Lewis was working on some kind of legislation. Do you recall what was in it or anything of that magnitude, like what it looked like, stuff like that?
The policy that Congressman John Lewis was working on was an environmental justice policy, a federal government overarching policy, right? So over 20 years ago, Congressman John Lewis put this bill forward, again, before Congress to say, hey, we need a general federal government policy that is very overarching, right? Because different states have their own policies and legislation where a state policy can be more stringent than the federal government, we know, but it can't be less stringent, right? And so the bill that Congressman John Lewis put forward was just an overarching environmental justice bill to say, hey, let's look at this in its entirety, okay? Let's make sure that we can have a legislation, have a bill to look at these different neighborhoods, communities of color that are undergoing environmental injustices, okay? And so it was a overarching bill on environmental justice. Congressman John Lewis came back again 20 years later and tried to put that bill forward again. So I had the honor of being able to, interview Congressman John Lewis during that time when he actually put that bill forward. And one of the questions that I did have for him was, do you think that under this current administration, which was our previous administration, the Trump administration, that this would actually, move past? Because we know that Trump was not, that's not his thing.
He had his own agenda.
Yeah.
Right, correct, to put it lightly.
I almost said God rest his soul, but I forgot he ain't dead.
He's acting like it, but go ahead.
I'm sorry, I almost said God rest his soul, but he ain't dead. My bad.
Y'all are hilarious.
My bad. I just scratched that.
Like
just scratch that. I didn't mean it.
So my question to the congressman was, kind of, come on now. This is an administration, but I think for, Congressman John Lewis and the way he answered that question was, we're going to still keep trying. And sometimes you politically, you put something forward to make a point, to say, we're going to keep trying. This is here, this is still happening with us. And I think that, for the late Congressman John Lewis, which was such a wonderful man, and I was so humbled to be able to sit down and talk with him about these different things. That was a big political point to say, hey, we're going to still keep trying. What I am hoping for now is in this Biden administration that we can go back to what Congressman John Lewis tried to put forward around environmental justice and revisit that. As you stated earlier, executive orders are directives to the federal government, but executive orders are not legislation. And of course, we know the president could come in and pull that back. Sure. And so what I'm hoping is that during this current administration, we can go back to that environmental justice bill that the congressman tried to put forward, and we can look at these different issues within all of these different states to try to get to what we call EJ.
So what does it look like in Georgia? Because we're all here. So what does the policy on environmental justice look like here? Is there one, or is it?
No, that we don't have a environmental justice policy here in Georgia. I feel that Georgia is very behind when it comes to these environmental justice issues. As we spoke of earlier, states can be more stringent in their policies with the federal government, but they can't be less stringent. California, very different, very, very different from Georgia. But I love California.
Oregon too, isn't it?
Oregon, I don't know if Oregon has an environmental justice policy, but I use California as a good example because they're very forward-thinking in the environment. And so I would like for Georgia to kind of get to I don't want to say a model of California, but let's try to get that
somewhere. Let's get somewhere.
That could be used as a good example, of that. But if we do have a federal policy, it would force states to look at themselves and what's going on specifically, in our different communities and what they're lacking and the disparities that are there. So that is something that I'm hoping for in this current administration.
So I think, okay, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, is there, when people have this conversation, I feel like they're always, the argument always has something to do with jobs. There's almost this idea that if there are going to be lots of jobs and lots of bustling economic opportunities and lots of financial wealth or success, then the environment cannot be a top concern. Is there some level to which that is true, to which if you really want great air quality, you cannot have but so many skyscrapers in a certain area, or if you really want great air quality, you can't have but so many.
Like
cars
you got to
or
pick. You got to pick
yeah,
one.
like is there some level of compromise that just has to be there?
I think that what we know now with climate change, with what green energy jobs, I think that can be created. I don't think that we have to pick one. If you would have posed that question maybe 15 years ago, probably so. But we are at a point where I don't think you have to pick your job or your health, because that's what you're looking at. It's going to be your job, it's going to be your health. And when we talk about these companies that come in neighborhoods, what they do is they come in neighborhoods and they say, hey, this is a low income neighborhood. They are politically powerless, but they do need some jobs. They do need money. So guess what? We're going to plant ourselves here so they could work for us. So now I'm picking my job. I'm picking money because I got to take care of my family, or I'm picking my health. Or I'm picking my health.
Companies do that. Lots of companies.
So what they do is they plant. And I'm sorry, when you said that, you made me think about that, because I think that's a good point. They plant themselves in these low income neighborhoods so they can get jobs.
Of course, yeah.
Right. But now with what we know now, I mean, we are in 2021. There's no excuse. We know the information. We know the science. We know what it looks like to sit down and talk with a chemical company and know why they are here and how much money they saved in being in this neighborhood versus another neighborhood. We know all of these different things now. So no, I don't think that at this day and time we have to pick one. I think that there is a way to be able to make sure that low income communities can still get good jobs, which is a part of environmental justice because it connects to your quality of life. They can still get good jobs and they can stay safe as well. That's where I know where we're at right now, but it takes that political power also and that political will to be able to sit down and be able to strategize and come up with that type of infrastructure.
I guess my question is trying to grapple with what does the language look like in that kind of legislation? Does it says, hey, in Atlanta, if we were to come up with something, we're saying Atlanta that a community has to have 3 grocery stores for a variety of options of the kind of fresh products that they get. Like, what is that legislation? What does that language sound like?
Well, so because environmental justice has this dynamic of quality of life, and there's so many different entities that are into that, there are different ways to accomplish those different things, right? So if you have a plan for the city and just say that plan is going towards clean energy and fighting against climate change, that could be a piece that is a policy, that is a piece of legislation where we can make sure that low income neighborhoods are getting what they need as far as getting jobs. When we look at MARTA, we know that MARTA has to be voted on, right? We know that there's certain neighborhoods that have voted against MARTA for years. They don't want those people. I don't want those people in my neighborhood. That's basically what they're saying. Let's be for real, right?
So explicitly what they're saying.
Yeah, they made no qualms about it. They made no qualms about it.
Right. I don't want you in my neighborhood.
Literally.
Because I know what comes with MARTA. You come with MARTA. I want you in my neighborhood. So when we look at things like that, that's another piece, Ricardo, right? So you have your jobs piece that can look a certain way, where there can be a plan for Atlanta, where you're making sure that specific neighborhoods are targeted and they are getting jobs, right? And they're still staying safe. You have another piece where you're looking at transportation. I'm just using Atlanta for an example, where you're looking at, okay, let's make sure that this neighborhood has transportation access. Well, what does that look like for that neighborhood? We're not going to buy everybody a car, but we know that we need MARTA in that neighborhood. So that means that political people have to come to the table, and we have to make sure that gets done. Of course, that still takes political power. That still takes legislation and voting, right? And so then there is another piece where we're looking at, we're going more back to what one may call the pristine environment, where we're looking at air, we're looking at water, and we're looking at chemicals and what's in this specific neighborhood here, as far as, air pollution. So there are different entities to that. There's not one piece of, not one bill, not one policy to that, because there are different intricacies of that, but it's looked at piece by piece where we can holistically, come together. When you're looking at grocery stores, and infrastructure and gentrification, the thing about gentrification is I think, coming into a neighborhood to make that neighborhood better and, having different amenities in that neighborhood and what the city has signed off on for a Publix to be there, for a grocery store to be there, let's get all these, we got $10 stores in the neighborhood.
Family
up and
Dollars.
down Family
Family Dollars.
Literally. Family Dollars in the neighborhood.
Block after.
McDonald's. But where's your Publix? I got to catch the MARTA to get to Publix. There's something wrong with that, right? So when we look at the infrastructure of how the city is built, those are looked at through, different policies. But it does take political will to do these things, and that's why we do have community-based organizations and advocacy organizations, to fight and advocate, for these different things. So it's looked at it in different ways. It's looked at through different pieces. To answer your question,
one of the things I was going to mention, when you said Publix, I was thinking about the vaccine, which this week they sold out within an hour, I think, giving out vaccines at a specific Publix in Georgia, which I was like, those are not a Publix in every neighborhood. There's two in Smyrna. But
I don't know.
But that's not close to
I don't know
everyone.
what that.
But
I don't know what that was.
What I was no, but there's not a Publix everywhere. I guess what I was saying is they chose Publix. They didn't choose Family Dollar. But one of my comments was going to be about the neighborhood. You talked about sidewalks a couple times, which I notice all the time. Areas where there's no sidewalks, or just like almost dilapidated sidewalks, if that's the word. Like there's just where you're almost safer just walking in the street than walking on the sidewalk. I think about all of this as maybe some of the qualitative pieces of environmental justice is what I was going to ask you about, because I think it's just a quality of life difference for kids and even for people, especially places where there's a lot of pedestrians. Like growing up, I grew up in Oregon, where there's so many parks per capita. It's one of the top 10 places where there's so many parks per capita. Like there's parks everywhere. There's always fresh open space. There's always places for people to go. So you don't see so much going on right in a neighborhood, or there's no reason to. I'm not saying there's no reason to loiter. Let me put this the right way. There's just less going on in highly trafficked areas or in business areas or business parks, because there's plenty of open space for people to just be. And I feel like that's one of the biggest things I noticed coming to Atlanta is not just that, well, is there less trees, or is there different water? It's just that in cities, there's less, for all the empty space that there is, which a lot of times there is just empty space. There is no land. There's no just safe carved out place. If there is for any given amount of time, it's because it's just been bought and it's about to turn into some sort of a business. But isn't there something to be said about quality of life when you can just walk down the street or drive down the street and you just see parks and trees and gardens and places where people can just go and be safe, whether it's with families or not?
Yes. Scientifically, what we found out through research is that's a great point that you make, going back to what we call now the built environment, right? And so having sidewalks in your neighborhood is a part of the built environment. How does that connect to health? That connects to health through, we can look at that as, looking at crime, and also look at obesity and being able to exercise, right? Because if I'm in my neighborhood and I don't have sidewalks, I grew up in a very poor neighborhood, right? I come from a low income family. So if I don't have sidewalks in my neighborhood, I don't want my children outside walking around. If I am in a bad neighborhood that's crime infested, I don't want my children or myself as well walking around, right? And so it all has a domino effect. So if I can't afford to pay for a gym membership, right? I can't afford to go to the gym, but I can walk, I can exercise. But if I don't have sidewalks, I don't feel safe. That means that can connect to obesity now, right? And so then we can connect that to chronic disease as well, right? And so the built environment is what you're describing when we look at open space and parks and being able to walk outside. That's all connected to what we call environmental injustice, when I don't have those different things in my neighborhood, it can connect to health disparities. Just like pollution connects to, when I walk outside and I smell, that connects to asthma. Right. Sure. So now we have these low income neighborhoods. Now we have these people of color neighborhoods, because this people of color bear more than their share of environmental hazards versus the white population. When we look at environmental injustices, now we have all of these underlying conditions of asthma, of obesity, of different chronic diseases, of childhood lead poisoning, because we're in houses that are built before 1978. We're all in very old houses, and all of this connects to health. So yes, that is definitely true. And what you're describing is the built environment, which connects to environmental injustice, which connects to health disparities, and it's all a domino effect.
Now y'all see why she here?
Oh yeah.
Now y'all see why she here? What you about to say, Kim?
I was going to ask, so since environmental justice is so subjective and it varies across like a wide array of factors, like, do you think we would benefit more from like a federal mandate that actually requires states and like localities to form their own environmental justice plans, or would we benefit more from like a federal bill, kind of similar to what Senator John Lewis was putting together, that actually just gives like a broad overarch of what should be done?
Well, I think both of those are great points, right? Because that federal, I can't go distinctly into the legislation that Congressman John Lewis was putting forward. I don't remember the details of that, to be completely transparent with you. But I think that you make a good point in that if we do have, federal legislation, we have a federal mandate that you do have to have an environmental justice plan, if you will, that really is in the context of what you need and what environmental justice looks like for Oregon, what environmental justice looks like for California, for Atlanta, for Georgia, or what have you. I think that would be just optimal, for us, because it requires you to do something. You
Right.
have to do something. You're going to get this money, or if you want this money, you have to do something. You're required to do that. I would love for that to happen, because what's been happening for years is that, you have different community-based organizations that are pushing this, where they're in a very specific neighborhood, they're in a
Right.
very specific place,
Right.
and they don't have the money. Most times they don't have that money to be able to. Organizations that I have come for, that have been clients of mine under the LS Whitehead Group LLC, that's my consulting firm, is to help these organizations, to be able to help them come up with, different health plans, to be able to help them come up with different activities around environmental justice, but it's to help their neighborhood, so that that's not the whole state. And so what's been happening for years is that you have different pieces here and there where this neighborhood is helped, okay, this neighborhood is helped, that's great, but this is a huge problem, overall. So I think that you make a great point for us to have something like that, where there is a mandate where we have to have these environmental justice plans, and they have to be, put into place. I was about to tell you something on that too, and I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought too much in my brain.
We do that all the time. We do that all the time. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, but
If I bring up
think
one
that's
more
a
thing, maybe we'll
great
come back to you,
point.
because it's around those same lines. Well, not quite around those same lines. That sounds like a liberal mandate.
But wait a minute.
But
Oh, I know
Go
what I
ahead.
was going to say.
Okay.
That political power. So when we go back to how these things happen, right? Clinton signed an executive order after remember we talked about Warren County, and they laid in the street in 1982. So you've gotten the attention of the world at that point. So you've gotten the attention of the world, and then after that you have a federal study that came out, Toxic Waste and Race. It was right after that. I want to say it was probably maybe 1985, 87. It was in the early 80s. And so Toxic Waste and Race showed again what we're talking about today, that, when we look at race and these other predictors, when we look at race, we can look at income, we look at all these different variables. Race was still the number one predictor of where pollution would be, right? And so it's still 20 years later, when they had the Toxic Waste and Race study that came out again. Now we have more science. Now we've moved forward with science. Still, race was the number one predictor of where, toxic waste landfills are going to be pushed. So when we think about political power in that push, when the Environmental Protection Agency created the Office of Environmental Justice, right? And that was under the Clinton administration. That same administration signed an executive order to say federal agencies, we need to look at environmental justice, specifically for people of color, low-income populations. That's what that executive order explicitly says under that, right? However, Clinton signed that executive order. The EPA came out with the Office of Environmental Justice. Why? This was after Warren County. So you got to do something, right? Because now we've gotten the attention of the world. So how does it look? And I'm not downing Clinton, and I'm not downing the executive order. But what I'm saying is it takes that political will, and sometimes something has to happen before we can get
For
that
anything.
before we get that policy. When you think about lead poisoning, I don't know if you're young. but you may recall some years ago. Remember when Toys R Us discovered that there was some
the toys,
lead poison in toys. Now it's a huge thing, right?
Moms were so upset.
Yes, but lead has been in toys down at the
Yep.
dollar store for years.
Yeah, but they were so upset. They went into bar trade with China because China had different
This
standards.
is huge.
And
Now it's on CNN. But when you look at low-income neighborhoods, I had to get my kids stuff from the dollar stores for years, and nobody said nothing,
Nope.
right? So we're looking at who it affects, the population, and who it actually affects. And that's when we get into dehumanization, when we're looking at specific populations that are treated better than other populations, right? So I said all that to say, looking at, what you were just suggesting and what you're saying, I think is an excellent point. And I'm hoping that nothing else has to happen to have that political will. I'm hoping that this is the administration that we can really make some progression. So
can we cover one more area?
But is it going to be a long one?
No, it's not. But look.
Because, wait, before you start,
Okay.
I want to get into, we've already explained the problem we've gotten into. Now I want to talk about solutions.
Okay.
Like, where do we start? Like, what do we need to do? What are the conversations we need to be having?
Okay.
So,
really quick, last one.
Fine.
This is big.
Fine.
It's about waste.
You got 2 minutes. Fine.
It's about waste management. I want the doctor to talk about the waste, because this is another thing that just blows my mind, is that I live in a place where there's a huge dumpster for my trash. There's no recycling. So every week, half of my trash is just recyclable products because of the stuff that I need from Amazon, who's, just recyclable stuff that there's nowhere to go unless I want to travel to like at least 20 minutes to find a recycling place where something might be. They don't take everything. And half the time it's like, well, I did go once and it was full and overflowing, but that used to be a thing. When I grew up, it was a thing. Recycling would come twice a week. Trash came like once a week. Trash can was this small. Recycling was this big. So if you wanted to get rid of your stuff, you had to, there was an incentivization there to recycle. And I just cannot believe.
Because they don't do it in your side, but where I live, they do it. That's the one thing they do. They do recycle. And
well, that is good.
That's weird, because that's the only thing they do. Outside of 15,000 Family Dollars I see every corner that I drive around.
Yeah.
But, okay.
Why is that a bigger deal? And I think it makes a difference because that's why there's so much crap everywhere. There's just filth everywhere.
Are you saying? I was just trying to make sure I got your question clear. Are you saying that you feel that people in the neighborhood don't recycle?
Well, when I lived in Vinings, there was a actual, there was I don't know if it was a contract through the city,
right,
or if it was just so popular that every single subdivision that I lived in picked one up on their own.
Right.
And it was a private contract, but there was a recycling service that just was available to people. Right. And it was in businesses that I would go to, stores that I would go to, even like the kind of can collections. When you go to the grocery store to return all your cans and get 5 cents or 25 cents. So you don't get nothing here for that.
What is your gripe?
My parents came to visit me and we're drinking soda and we're like, okay, can we take these to the store? And I'm like, you don't get nothing.
What is the gripe? What is the gripe?
Why don't we recycle?
So,
and why do some neighborhoods recycle? Upper class neighborhoods, East Cobb neighborhoods, all those neighborhoods have recycling.
Right. So that's a good point, because what we're looking at now is what we have to think about is how the environment looks to specific neighborhoods and what that means for policy, right? So, and how important that is for people, right? When people talk about, one thing that I would like going into, and I'm going to go into you're talking about solutions, going into environmental justice in the environment. When most people think about the environment, they think about something very pristine and out there, like, oh, it's just a tree, we're cool, we're good,
right? Which explains his reaction to recycling.
Tree huggers,
right? Like it doesn't affect me, and so that's still what you're talking about. Still gets back to the ideology of what people really feel and think about the environment and what that means and how that connects to my health, how it looks in one neighborhood versus other neighborhood. Okay, so we have those are city policies that you're talking about, right? Those are county policies that you're talking about. That's a state policy. And so when you get very specific and that granular, and you're talking about a different departments and these stores and how recycling looks in that neighborhood versus that neighborhood, those are policies that go back to the city that say, hey, well, this neighborhood, do they really need recycling? Are they really thinking about that? But we go in this neighborhood, we know that we want to make sure that
they'll use it.
Exactly. They're going to use it. The waste is not going to be there. We want to keep that neighborhood clean. That goes back to policy. That goes back to ideology and how you're thinking about specific neighborhoods and how they think about the environment.
This is lighting a fire under me.
Good.
We got to get these mentalities out of the neighborhoods. So that we can get the policies in there.
The policies and policy makers and who are these decision makers and how they make these things happen. So when we talk about, one thing that I would love to see that I'm fighting for in my different contexts and where I sit is having this conversation of environmental justice where it's not something so people
grandiose.
Yes, because it's a part of your
practical.
everyday life. Yes, yes, perfect language. It's very practical.
It's very practical.
Yeah. And so we have to get to that point where people understand that. So we're not having a conversation when something bad has happened, not when a debacle has happened, such as a Flint. Yeah, that was a debacle. So that's one thing that I would like us, I want to be us to be able to, and when I say us, the federal government, state government, schools, universities, students, and to be able to understand when I'm talking about jobs, I'm talking about the environment. When I'm talking about transportation, I'm talking about the environment. When I'm talking about my children, I'm talking about the environment. When I'm talking about what I'm going to do when I get out of college, I'm talking about the environment. It's all a part of everyday life. And we have to get to that point so we can create policies that move forward and what we need them to do.
So I guess that's the question, because we're winding down. So where do we start to start this conversation that it's a everyday conversation at some point? Where do we start at to even get this thing in motion?
I think that we start in, we make this very pronounced in schools and universities. We make it very pronounced in the federal government, where the federal government does have directives that we have to be able to address these issues. We make this very pronounced, and of course that's an executive order. We make this very pronounced when we look at state government and what they're doing around environmental justice. I think it has to be in every conversation, but to be in every conversation and dialogue, it has to be in these different entities, and then that needs to be connected to policy. It needs to be the city of Atlanta. It needs to be, under the mayor's office. It needs to be, in the state of Georgia, where you're looking at state policies. It needs to come out of the senator's mouth when he goes to Congress and he says, okay, this is what we're looking at around, EJ. We don't have anything, California has this, but those conversations usually start with community-based organizations where CBOs are trying to go to congressmen and say, hey, this is what we need, where they're trying to go to, Congress and saying, hey, this is what we need around environmental justice. And those conversations are happening, in different entities. And so what we all hope for here, I know, in this capacity, literally where I'm at right now here in your studio, is that, and that's what I mean, is that, we can have these different dialogues and different entities, but it's not just, top down. It's, top down, and it's also, from the ground up, and that it reaches everyone. So, we can have that federal government overarching environmental justice bill, and then other legislation too, where it affects our cities, because we can do better. We can do so much more than what's happening now.
Well, we have to.
We have to.
Now that you had this conversation, and all the people that are watching are going to watch the replay, you see the correlation. I don't think previously there was any correlation to environment in my everyday life. Because even when we had the conversation, I was like, I did not even think about. Because when you said it, I was like, I said tree huggers. I was like, oh, this is a tree hugger conversation. That'll be cute. Talk about recycling and paper and trees. And then when we had the conversation, it was like, oh, this is a whole different ballgame. And this is at the core of a lot of the issues that we're trying to Band-Aid, because they're attached to this ideology, this concept. So that's why I want to have this conversation. Did y'all see why she's here? That's why I want to have this conversation today, because it makes a major difference. And we can stop Band-Aiding our communities and actually fix the problems that we're having. So my last question, we got like 4 minutes. So is now the perfect time to really have lobbyists in the federal government with other lobbyists and have this conversation with, Warnock and Ossoff? They just got there. Y'all be, talking about, is this the perfect time to say, hey, we know you got a bunch of issues, but this is major. We need to start talking about this. Is now the time, the window by which to have this conversation?
Now is the perfect time to be able to sit down and, really assess different neighborhoods in your state, in our state. Really assess, when we look at the built environment, what are in these particular neighborhoods? What are the underlying conditions and health disparities that these different neighborhoods, the different populations have right now? This is national data. We have this data, so we all know how that looks, right? Mm-hmm. So now is the time to really assess the neighborhoods. Now is the time to assess transportation. Now is the time to assess what we call the built environment, look at underlying conditions connected to health. We all know what this looks like, but now is the time to say, what are we going to do about it? Where do we start? And who do we need to talk to when we look at gentrification, when we look at, affordable housing? All this is a part of environmental justice. So we're going to fix up this neighborhood. We need to make sure these people can still live there. We need to make sure that they have the different amenities that they need to have to accomplish and get to what we call environmental justice, to get to what we call sustainability. And so now is the time to assess and be able to look at our different centers. Hey, you're here. Love it. Great. Now
do something.
We have to look at what we need to do. Yeah, so now is the time. And then when we look at this in a bigger format with the federal government, let's go Biden. Let's look at, let's go Biden, let's go Vice President Harris, and let's look at, environmental justice in its entirety and what we need and what we've been suffering from for years, and what is the solution. Where have we been for these past few years? What's happened? We have grown. Different things have happened. We've made some progression. I will say that, but we're still not where we need to be. But we can get there. So now is the time to look at this on a federal level, a state level, and a local entity, because we definitely can do better, especially in the state of Georgia as well. And it's perfect timing. So I'm hoping that things will progress, and I'm hoping that if you and I ever have this conversation again,
which we will,
we can say, "Hey, look what just happened." It's a step in the right direction. So. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for the average Joe, if I'm listening to this and I just feel on fire and I want to do something, what can I do? Like, is there an organization I can reach out to volunteer with? What can I do?
You can. So there are different things. You can look at what's already happening. So just say you wanted to go to, a lot of times it's good if you want to go to your community-based organization. That's one entity where you can say, okay, I have a community-based organization around the corner, or you can look up one. And it may be environmental justice. It may be racial equity. And if they're looking at racial equity and they have some sense of EJ, more than likely they're working on EJ. So what are they doing? And you can, fall in line. I don't want to say fall in line with them, but you can partner with them or see how you can add and advocate with them, right? You can call your local congressman and you can ask your congressman, what's going on around environmental justice, or something specifically is going on in your neighborhood. Because anyone can go to Congress, right? Mm-hmm. Students can go to Congress. Oh, yeah. Students can get together, and say, hey, this is what's happening. This is what we would like to see happen, because your congressman has to go to Congress. There are different committees in Congress, and there is an environmental committee in Congress, right? Mm. And so you also can call, your local politicians with different groups of people, and I say community-based organizations because CBOs, they do that a lot, where they partner with each other and say, hey, this is what's happening. I want to be in on this. Mm-hmm. I have some students that want to be in on this. Let's go to our congressman. Let's tell them, what's happening here, okay? And we want to take this back to Congress. You can go to your mayor as well. So these are different entities where you can go to, where you're looking at, your politicians, and be able to. And if you're not so privy to the information and educated on the information, that's why I say you can call, different community-based organizations and see what they're doing, and try to, grasp your mind around this thing called environmental justice and what that actually looks like for your neighborhood. So there's a political way, to do that as well.
How do people get in touch with you?
You can get, you said this to me last time, and I don't know. So.
You know you have to do that. I mean, you have to do that.
I know. I'm so okay. So
IG,
I have
Facebook,
my Instagram, yes, and
website.
My Instagram is DRL Whitehead, so I'm not on there that much. DRL Whitehead is my Instagram. I'm also on Facebook as LaToria Whitehead. I'm in LinkedIn, LaToria Whitehead, PhD, MPH, as well. And my website is not up yet. Okay. But if you put my name in, LaToria Whitehead, in those entities, I will definitely come up. And that's how people usually get in touch with me, through social media.
All right, final thoughts. 20 seconds. Cam, go.
Well, this is very fascinating. Just seeing how just discrimination on different spectrums just kind of really trickled down to everyday practical life, even the things we eat, the resources that are available in our hometown. Because I have in my hometown, I have one grocery store that specializes in selling pork. So it's just just listening about this just really puts a lot into perspective about where my hometown in South Carolina really needs to be. So Like, I
Yes.
was really grateful to be sitting in this conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Simone?
It was fascinating to me too. I would love to have another conversation maybe where we could talk more about the other correlations, because I do know science knows that homicide rates are correlated to some extent with like the frequency of park use or just other publicly available safe spaces. So there's a lot of different ways in which investing more in the environment could be helpful, not just, for air quality
Absolutely.
or clean streets, even though those are critically important.
Right.
I just want to say I told y'all so. I told y'all this conversation is going to be amazing, and that's why I was looking forward to Dr. White, because I didn't grasp I didn't make the correlation. And once we had our initial conversation, I was blown for days. I was like, oh my God, this could solve so many other problems. So special thanks to today's guest, Dr. LaToria Whitehead. Thank you for being with us. This will not be your last. And
much.
check it out. You need to really look into environmental justice, especially persons of color, because this could really be a solution to a lot of the problems that we are having that we didn't know anything about. So we will see you guys next Friday when it's just Blend Family next Friday. It's just going to be us going at it. No guests, just us. So tune in next Friday, same time, same place, on the Leadership Blend Live podcast with your host, Ricardo D. Rice.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure.
This was awesome.
Okay, I'm about to say
Okay,
we were waiting on you.
All right.
Well, I thought we were gonna. See, when I first heard about it, I thought it was about Native Americans.
What?
I did
Why would I
because
have a conversation about Native Americans?
because
Well,
it's their
yeah.
this is their religion.